there is a real public interest and a government interest in making sure that short lines are able to keep these lines viable, right? Because if they're not, if a short line doesn't succeed and can't stay in business, the line will be ripped up for scrap and gone, right? And now you're moving, that's a disadvantage to the shippers that would be on that line. That's a killer for the local community. That's worse for the environment. That's worse for congestion. That's worse for wear and tear on the highway. That's worse for it's more truck tires being shredded. It's, much worse for safety, despite all the East Palestine hoopla over the last couple months. Moving freight by rail is far, like 20 times safer than moving it on the highway. So it's kind of worse for everybody if short lines don't survive. And so that's why I think there's been a lot of, even among our regulators at the FRA who are, on our case about safety stuff, wearing their other hat, they're very supportive of our infrastructure needs.
You may know the American Railway Engineering and Maintenance of Way Association, or AREMA, as the, quote, keepers of the manuals. You may know them as the, quote, people behind the largest annual railroad conference in North America. Heck, you may not know about AREMA at all. This podcast is designed, no pun intended, to change your view of who AREMA is and how AREMA has changed the trajectory of many railway careers over its 100-plus year history. Welcome to Platform Chats with your host, Walt Bleser, where he takes a moment to discuss the impacts AREMA has had on the very people who are proud to be called members. Are you ready to roll with AREMA?
ARE Corporation is a proud supporter of AREMA and Platform Chats. If you are looking to take your railway structures career to the next level, or simply start it down the right track, please visit us at arecorp.com. Please see our brand new job postings on our careers page or on our LinkedIn page.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Platform Chats. I am your host, Walt Bleser, and this is probably a voice you have not heard in a bit. We have had a bit of a hiatus here at Platform Chats. Unfortunately, the worldwide headquarters of Platform Chats, aka my house, had a water leak mid-March that decided to leak onto my kitchen and did a sizable amount of damage to the home. And it has created plenty of anxiety for me, my wife, and my littles. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And as Chuck and I were chatting before this episode, we're actually moving out in a couple days because we got a couple months worth of work. So yes, excuses. I get it. You want your content. But we have to work within the confines of the fact that this is not my only job, contrary to popular belief. But we are back, and we're going to attempt a new series of speaking with leaders of other associations that complement and or are associated with AREMA. And there's a whole host of them, and I'm going to let Chuck talk about that here in a bit. But we're going to start with Chuck Baker, a longtime friend of mine, known him for quite some time. Currently, he is the president of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. He's got a really great story of how he got to this position. And I think you're going to learn a lot along the way, not just about short lines, but just how someone can enter into such a tight-knit community and a tight-knit group of folks, a fraternity, if you will, sorority, if you will, of people that work together. So sorry for the long intro, but I just felt like I owed everybody an explanation as to why there's such a gap in episodes. So Chuck, my friend, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I would agree, longtime friend of yours. I would also say longtime friend of AREMA, which we can get into. And I would say before we do any rail stuff, just as a expression of public sympathy, as a fellow homeowner, a leak that necessitates having to move out of your house for some period of time is pretty brutal. The closest I've had is like a flooded basement that was only a couple days of hassle, and that just is rough. And so I commend you for managing to keep your day job plus your podcasting job plus deal with all that.
Well, thank you. So, talk to me about, again, I know your story, but tell everybody else your story, how a guy named Chuck Baker wandered his way through life and now he sits atop one of the larger organizations in our industry.
Yeah, well, it's I appreciate the question. It's always I like to tell sort of my origin story. It's kind of a fun one, I guess, or at least fun for me. Um, my I graduated Rice University, which is a school down in Houston, 2001, and my first job out of college, maybe because I didn't have any better ideas, was investment banking. So I went out to San Francisco and I did like corporate finance and tech, M&A, and equity and debt raises. And um, I don't have any regrets. The job pays quite well for a first job out of college, and it's fast paced and interesting enough and good people. But I pretty quickly realized that was not. It didn't kind of get my engine humming. It wasn't something I loved. I was talking about like network architect infrastructure and online storage and stuff, and I just didn't know what I'm talking about, and I'm moving other people's money around, and like I was just like, this is not what I want to do with my career. I should find something that I actually am interested in. What do I want to go spend? Well, at the time, I thought 80 hours a week was a normal amount of time to spend because that's what you do as an investment banking analyst. But what do I want to go spend my waking hours doing? And so I thought about it, and I was always been interested in kind of like, very broadly speaking, like urban planning, land use, transportation, just sort of something in that world. And so actually I left investment banking after 2 years. I took my bonus and I was traveling South America with a friend, with a couple friends actually, but one friend in this part, and we were hiking the Inca Trail. And so we were sleeping within a few miles of Machu Picchu. And he was asking me the same question. He's like, well, so what are you going to do? And I repeated the same thing about interested in land use, urban planning, blah, blah. And I had already decided I was going to move to DC because I thought there are a lot of those kinds of jobs in DC, and I'm from Baltimore. And so he listened to all that and he's like, so you want to be a railroad lobbyist? And I was like, well, that's kind of specific, but like, yeah, like that would be great. And he's like, I happen to have a great friend from high school in Topeka, Kansas, who works at what is the premier boutique rail lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. Do you want to talk to him? And I was like, boy, I'd love to. And so eventually I moved to D.C. This is like beginning of 2004. And I ended up getting an internship with somebody else working for free that I met at like a transportation research board conference. But I eventually met this guy, Adam Nordstrom, who was my friend from San Francisco's buddy from high school in Topeka, Kansas. And I go in to interview with Adam, and he worked at Chambers, Conlon, and Hartwell at the time. And Adam was like just a few years older than me. So I interviewed with him, and then Keith Hartwell and Ray Chambers, who were his bosses and partners at the time at CCNH. And we had a long conversation, and it was sort of about one job at first, and then it transitioned to about another job. But they were like, well, we manage this association here called the NRC, the National Railroad Construction and Maintenance Association. And we need somebody to help manage it. It was like a 2-person staff association at the time. It's grown now, but obviously way smaller than AREMA is by comparison. At the time, at least, they said we need somebody to manage it, and they said you don't meet any of the criteria we were looking for. You said you don't have any construction experience, you don't have any rail experience, you don't have any association experience, and you don't have any Capitol Hill experience. But we needed somebody 2 months ago, and if you're willing to take a 60% pay cut from your last job in investment banking, like, you can have the job and you start tomorrow. And so I was like, I'll start tomorrow. And so that is how I started at the NRC, and that was basically like March 2004. And it was very, very obvious to me very quickly that I loved it. Now, I mean, look, it's still a job. I don't want to pretend like every day was like bounding through flower fields, but I immediately liked it, and they gave me a lot of responsibility, and the NRC has a ton of overlap with AREMA. NRC is a trade association, so it's representing companies, not individuals, but obviously a huge amount of overlap with the people that participate in AREMA. So it was Herzog and Railworks and Delta Railroad Construction and Railroad Construction of South Jersey and L.B. Foster and A&K and all these companies. And so we have an annual conference, and it was like, Chuck, plan the annual conference, like sign the F&B contracts with the hotel, pick the hotel, find the speakers. And so the speakers are like the VPs of engineering from all the class ones and some of the short line holding companies and some of the commuters and inner city. And so I got to know all those people. And then it was like, we care about legislative and regulatory outcomes. So go lobby Congress on grant funding, on short line railroad tax credits, on definition of who's a railroad carrier and who's not, and go sit on the RSAC at the FRA. And so I did all that, and I was just immersed in it from kind of all day, every day. And, over time, the association grew and grew. And eventually I went from manager to vice president to executive vice president, and then eventually president when Ray Chambers, was stepping down and doing kind of other things and was no longer wanted to be president of the association. And so I, it was a couple of years of like fake it till you make it. And then eventually I sort of figured out what I was doing. And then I had a very nice, like pretty long run as president of the NRC and doing some other clients at CCNH. But that's what I did for a long time through all the 2000s and, well into the 2010s.
And NRC grew quite a bit, right, underneath your leadership?
It did. It grew pretty nicely. It, when I started, the annual conference was probably about 400 or 500 people. And then it went 600, 700, 825, 950, 1,000, 1,100, 1,200. And I think by my last one, the conference was like about 11 or 1,200 people. So, about tripled in size over course of 15 years. And I don't take a lot of credit for that, right? Like I got to be there at a very good time for rail contractors and rail construction. CapEx and maintenance spending from the class ones grew very meaningfully over like a 10-year window. Plus short lines were growing nicely, and short lines are they're obviously far, 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 far smaller than class ones, and we'll get into that, but they have more than their fair share of creating business for contractors because they're so lean. They rely on contractors and engineering firms much more heavily than class ones do, which do a lot of in-house work. And then also the commuter rail and light rail and rail transit and heavy rail and even streetcar, God help me, parts of the world were growing pretty nicely in that kind of 10 or 15-year window. And if you're a rail contractor or engineering, and, obviously I think all of your listeners would know this, but if you can provide service, if you can fix rail or install ties or fix ballast or inspect track or whatever, you can do it for anyone who runs on track. So if you can do it for BNSF, you can also do it for the K&O short line. You can also do it for Amtrak. You can also do it for the MARC commuter rail. You can also do it for Phoenix light rail, right? You can also do it for San Francisco BART. So all the kind of the end use markets of NRC contractors were growing pretty nicely in that time. And so the association grew quite a bit.
So when did you switch from NRC to the ASLRRA?
Right. So for, a long time, probably, I don't know, call it 8 or 9, 10 years when I was at CCNH, I was really primarily doing NRC. As I started to get older and sort of more experienced, in addition to doing NRC, I was also spending more and more time doing lobbying for the Short Line Association because they were also a client of Chambers, Conlin, and Hartwell. I was also doing lobbying for Norfolk Southern, for Canadian National, for the One Rail Coalition, for the American Railway Development Association. So I was spreading my wings a little bit, as they say. But I got to spend more and more time with the Short Line Association as a client. And my colleagues, Keith Hartwell and Adam Nordstrom, were both senior to me and doing kind of leading it, but I was there and, more and more involved by the day and by the year. And then eventually they both, moved on to be focusing on other things. And they're both still very good friends and very busy in the rail world, both of them. But it became where I got to be the lead government affairs person for the Short Line Association. And so I was doing that at CC&H, and that was all fine. And then in 2018, getting my calendar right, mid 2018, Linda Darr, who was the president of the Short Line Association at the time, called and said, I'm leaving. And she said, I got a new job at the American Council of Engineering Companies, and I love my short line friends, but ACEC is twice as big and it's a new challenge, and I'm out of here. And so I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. And then my next call was from Judy Petrie, who was chairwoman of the board at the time and the president of Farm Rail, which is a kind of a sizable regional railroad in Oklahoma. And she called and she said, well, Chuck, we're going to have to run a process to find the next president, but my first choice is you. Would you be interested? And I was like, well, caveat, I got to see a contract, but yes, obviously I'd be very, very interested. And so they ran a process. It took, 8 months. They, recruiting firm and the whole deal, and, very serious kind of thorough process. But at the end of the day, I feel very lucky, but they chose me to run it, and they asked me to run it and offered me the job. And so I said yes. And so I left CC&H and I went in-house at the Short Line Association. So the office is like a mile on the other side of the Capitol. And so I have a slightly further walk from home now. Now I'm in-house. I'm an employee of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association as president. And we've got like a 15 or 16 person staff. And I now do short line railroad all day, every day.
Oh, well, that's a excellent transition. So, that was a good long run though. 15 years at the same place, this day and age, that's almost unheard of. So, hats off to you and CCH. I've met several folks over there, and that's a good group of people. I know they merged into another company. Is that correct?
They did. They merged into Blank Rome, which is like a global law firm with a DC lobbying presence. And some of the same folks, probably some of the same ones you still knew there, Don Norton and Katie Catchell, they're still there and they're still cranking away. They've got Alaska Railroad as a big client, for instance, which is one of my biggest regional railroad members of the association. And so I still interact with those folks every day, and it's a great place.
So let's jump into what is the definition of a short line. I think a lot of people, when they think of the railroads, they think of, I know you and I discussed this earlier, there's 7 now. I believe there is 6 because of CPKC.
Yeah.
That's official. Their matrimony is official. So we have 6 class 1s. But is it defined by, I'm just going to lob you a softball here. What is it defined by, and how do we understand what a short line is versus a class 1?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you could argue a meaningful portion of my job is essentially explaining the answer to this question. So you can tell me if I do it well, that's good. And if I don't do it well, like God knows what I'm doing here. But so technically, the difference between a class 1 railroad and a short line railroad is a revenue distinction, right? So it's set by the folks over at the Surface Transportation Board, and the 6 biggest railroads in the country are the class 1 railroads, the ones everyone knows: Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, UP, CN, and now CPKC. Technically, that means any railroad that's over $900 million in revenue. Those actually are all far, far, far north of that. I think the smallest of those is like $8 billion in revenue. And so technically, class 2 and 3 railroads are what we call short line and regional railroads. And so that's anything under 900 million. Now, in reality, even the biggest of them is like 400 million range. And most of them are more like 10 million or $20 million range. Most of them are quite small companies. So technically it's a revenue distinction, but practically what it means is like short lines play a very, very different role in the network than class ones. I think the easiest way to think about it is class ones are your long haul line haul, and short lines are your like first and last mile and your branch lines. So not for this audience because these are all rail experts, but when I'm explaining this to folks on the Hill, a lot of times I'll use an airline analogy, like the class ones are your American and your United, and your short lines are your American Eagle and United Express and stuff like that. So kind of the first mile, last mile, the feeder lines. And without boring people with a history lesson, a lot of what are now short lines, if you go back a couple generations to around the Staggers Act in the 80s, a lot of them used to be class one branch lines. And they were, I think everyone would acknowledge, so I'm not throwing any shade here, everyone would acknowledge that they were sort of the unloved, unwanted, unsuccessful, really marginally viable branch lines, right? The class ones couldn't make any money running them. They didn't fit with the operating model. It doesn't make sense to buy $5 million locomotives and go serve two customers 40 miles down some dingy branch line. You can't justify spending all this private money to maintain the track. You can't justify paying the full kind of class one wage scale to people to go serve like two small customers. And so blessedly, instead of abandoning those lines and ripping up the track and literally selling it for scrap, what they did in many, many cases was say, well, instead of having this be the unloved, unwanted branch line of the Union Pacific, why don't we sell this 70-mile section to some guy who lives by it and ask him if he wants to turn it into a short line railroad? So instead of being like the Las Cruces branch line, it now becomes the Las Cruces and Santa Fe short line railroad, right? And it's run by the guy who lives on that line. His whole life becomes get one more customer on that line, do anything that I can possibly do to serve the 4 customers who are on that line. If they need to be switched twice on Sunday morning, like, here's my cell phone. I'm the president of the railroad. I will come out and switch your darn cars myself. And then there's other differences too that we can get into depending on how much time we have here. Short lines have, different regulatory structures. We have tax credits that we can use that class ones can't. We can get grant money that class ones don't want or need and don't ask for. And so the economics and the operational profile, the culture, the size, everything is really very, very different than kind of the big class one railroads that most people are most familiar with.
And to pile on there, it sounds very much like the government recognizes how important these lines are. So even though, to your point earlier about ripping up for scrap, they're willing to step in and say, okay, short line owner, I'm also willing to give you grant money. We're going to be partners in that. Is that correct? Is that a good take?
That is a fair take. And that is mostly true most of the time. It doesn't mean that, so almost all short lines are privately owned, and they're, the private owner has the responsibility to maintain them. Although some of them actually literally are owned by like a public utility or a state DOT, but, probably 500 of the 550 of the 600 or so are privately owned. But yeah, we are not shy about asking for both federal and state help. And blessedly, to your point, those folks have been pretty willing to support us. There is, I say famously, at least famously in my world, there is the 45G tax credit, which is like for probably 15 years was our number one legislative priority in the Short Line Association. And the only reason it's not now is because the credit is permanent, or at least it's in there until a future Congress takes it out. So blessedly, I get to spend less of my time talking about it. But that's there's a tax credit that essentially matches the first $7,000 that we invest in any track mile in a given year, matches that at 50%. So it provides a $3,500 tax credit. So that's a huge help for maintaining short line infrastructure. And then there's also grant money available. There's a couple of federal grant programs out there, RAISE, Infra, PIDP, but the big one is CRISI. and that has hundreds of millions of dollars available every year. And short lines are a directly eligible applicant. They don't even need to find a public partner to ask. They can apply directly, and we've done, frankly, pretty well in CRISI. Typically about half of the CRISI program every year has been going to short lines, which over the last few years has meant about 150 million bucks a year going into short line infrastructure out of the FRA. And then this year, CRISI is now way bigger because it's the first year of the big infrastructure bill. And so that could mean like $500, $600, $700 million going into short line infrastructure this year, which is, now you're talking real money. So we'll see. Those awards will be decided in probably July or August, so we're probably still a few months away. But there's real support, and I would agree that it stems from the philosophy that there is a real public interest and a government interest in making sure that short lines are able to keep these lines viable, right? Because if they're not, if a short line doesn't succeed and can't stay in business, the line will be ripped up for scrap and gone, right? And now you're moving. That's a disadvantage to the shippers that would be on that line. That's a killer for the local community. That's worse for the environment. That's worse for congestion. That's worse for wear and tear on the highway. That's worse for it's more truck tires being shredded. It's, much worse for safety, despite all the East Palestine hoopla over the last couple months. Moving freight by rail is far, like 20 times safer than moving it on the highway. So it's kind of worse for everybody if short lines don't survive. And so that's why I think there's been a lot of, even among our regulators at the FRA who are, on our case about safety stuff, wearing their other hat, they're very supportive of our infrastructure needs.
And so there's so much to unpack here. I'm really enjoying this, by the way. It's just it's a look under the hood, I think, too, on a very specific area in our industry. A couple things. So you just talked about a lot of navigation of grants and working through the government, and you yourself are a lobbyist, and I don't need to go down the path of how do you become a lobbyist, but it sounds like this organization that you're running is there really to assist these owners navigate those waters. Is that a fair take?
Largely, and obviously this is very different than AREMA, but for a trade association, representing companies based in DC, I would say the way we operate and focus is pretty normal. Like, we do a lot of things. We have an annual conference. We have a weekly newsletter that goes to 10,000 people. We have safety compliance templates. We have webinars to learn about all sorts of stuff. But really, at the end of the day, the reason we exist is to help the short line industry with legislative and regulatory issues, right? So that is absolutely where I spend the majority of my time. It's where the majority of our staff lives. And so we spend most of our time focused on legislation, and whether we're talking about grants or tax credits or safety legislation, and then time with the FRA on safety regulatory stuff, and time with the STB on economic regulatory stuff. And so, that's largely why we exist, to kind of help the industry deal with that. I would say the only thing I would sort of quibble about maybe the way you said it is we don't really exist to help individual railroads navigate an individual grant program, right? Like if the K&O Railroad is applying for a CRISI grant, I'm not involved in the application, and I don't get to have a say on whether they win the grant. My role was really like making sure CRISI existed, making sure there's a big pie, making sure the rules are fair, and then trying to provide as much air cover as I can to short lines, telling folks at the FRA and Congress that, like, hey, every short line application is great and you should spend all your money on short lines. But when they do still have to go fight for pieces of the pie, and there are limits to my magic powers. And so we kind of help industry as a whole.
But you're really helping to create that pie, like the CRISI that you mentioned earlier. I mean, I'm familiar with that. The company I currently work for, we help railroads to short lines. We do a lot of short line work, and we do quite a bit of CRISI grant work.
Yep.
But it's really what you guys have done on the Hill to make that available for us to even apply
Yep.
and to help these owners do so. And another interesting thing I was thinking about as you were talking about class ones versus short lines and regionals, when you stand back, the 20,000 foot view of the pedestrian, if you will, not in the organization or in the industry that we are in, would say, not as much has really happened since 1996 or so, back when it was the Santa Fe and the Burlington Northern coming together and making big headlines. Now CPKC was a big one, but that's been many, many, many years since 1996. But if you're in the know, it does seem like holding companies, which I would like you to briefly touch on, are very active right now. And it seems like in the short line industry, there is a lot of purchasing and acquiring and slowly building these holding companies that are sizable industry, sizable businesses.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That is definitely something like you're now kind of getting into specialized knowledge that like even not everyone in the rail industry knows, and certainly like most people in the broader world would have no idea what we're talking about here, but that's okay. We've got a podcast with rail geeks hopefully listening to this. So there are 600-ish individual short lines in the country, and most of them, like we said earlier, they're first mile, last mile. They don't connect to other short lines, they connect to class ones. But over time, there is built up quite a bit of common ownership of many of these. And so Genesee in Wyoming is the biggest short line holding company. Watco is probably the second biggest. There's Patriot Rail, Omnitrax, RJ Corman, Regional Rail. And so there's starting to be some groups that own quite a few of these. G&W is the biggest. They own about 100 short lines. And, if you think about it, it makes a ton of sense, right? Now, there's no network effects of like, if you own a short line in Georgia and you own a short line in Arizona, it's not like they can interchange traffic with each other or you can get a longer haul. And so in a sense, it doesn't matter that much, right? Like it's not like the railroad looks different the day before it was owned by G&W versus the day after it was owned by G&W. But there are efficiencies to be had, right? If you own 100 short lines, you don't need 100 different CFOs. You don't need 100 different website guys. You don't need 100 different lawyers. You don't need 100 different procurement people, right? So you get to centralize some of that and you get to achieve some real efficiencies. And so, I think the growth of the holding company model, it makes a ton of sense. You can see why it's grown. There are far more short lines owned by holding companies now than there were decades ago. And frankly, that probably continues. Now, there are also, by the same token, still hundreds of like purely independent, or maybe like somebody owns 2 short lines. And a lot of those folks are proudly and fiercely independent and they're family owned and they don't, they haven't wanted to sell to a holding company. And some of those are like our most colorful and like legendary short lines and ones we love to talk about and show off the most. And so it's all fun. One of the fun parts about my job is like both of those same, G&W to like the smallest individual mom and pop short line are members of the association. And so, at the federal level, like at the regulatory FRA and STB and congressional level, blessedly, and I would say appropriately, they still treat an individual short line as an individual short line. It doesn't really matter who owns it, but it is, you can, if you're into like M&A and private equity and valuation conversations, there's a lot of very interesting stuff with short lines being kind of bought and sold and acquired and merged and unmerged over the years. And that's a pretty active little part of our world.
And there was a pretty big splash. What, a year or two ago? Was it G&W that sold to a major asset holding company?
Yeah, well, I think more than a year or two ago at this point. It probably goes back. Oh boy, I think it's probably 3 or 4, even 5 years now. But yeah, G&W was sold to Brookfield, which is a huge private equity player. that really made and continues to make kind of very little difference on the ground. Like a G&W railroad still looks like a G&W railroad, and Brookfield blessedly is kind of like a Berkshire Hathaway style owner. Like they own quite a few infrastructure assets and they seem to want to hold them forever, right? So there's no like flipping or anything like that. And so, I don't know anyone at Brookfield, and I probably don't have any need to know anyone at Brookfield. Like I work with G&W's management, but yeah, that was interesting. And just more recently, like Patriot Rail, which had about 15 short lines, bought Pioneer Lines, which had about 15 short lines, and that created a larger Patriot Rail. So now they have about 30 short lines. So there's always kind of stuff happening on that front. Like I said earlier, if you went out and looked at the railroad, it doesn't tend to matter that much. Like they still got the same locomotives and the same staff and the same customers, but behind the scenes on the corporate side, there's some interesting gymnastics.
And I think that just is a validation too. When Wall Street sniffs around and says this is a good investment, right? It's just yet more validation that this industry is still, no pun intended, chugging along in more ways than one, right? If PE can come in and say, I see an ROI here that I like, even if I'm going to hold it for 20 years or 3, versus any other industry that they could go purchase or acquire or touch, I think that speaks highly of what these holding companies have done and are continuing to do, and how much of an intricate and important piece they play into the national rail system, which I keep coming back to how intricate and how important short lines are to the class ones. And they need each other, right? I think that's kind of where I was going.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I appreciated the chugging along analogy, by the way. And I do think we should probably be commended for our lack of rail puns. And we haven't used.
I try hard.
We haven't used derailed. We haven't used off the track. Like there's a lot. But I do think it's, and look, I'm a biased observer here, but I do think it's sort of widely acknowledged that this short line story has been an incredible success story over the last couple decades, and that they've really taken, these hundreds of like kind of unloved redheaded stepchildren and turned them into like, you're generally not getting rich owning a short line, but they've turned them into like thriving, successful, viable businesses, and really not only have maintained the lines like they've originally set out to do, but they've in many cases grown them substantially and provided I think world-class service to customers that desperately want and need it, and enable these small towns that are moving ag and metals and minerals and those types of products, allow those communities to thrive. And yeah, the fact that private equity and Wall Street, quote unquote, like recognizes that is, I think, a nice validation. We don't want the financialization of short lines, and we don't primarily exist to like make investors money. We exist to serve our customers. But hey, if people can make some money buying and selling them and owning them, then that's good.
Yeah, that's good for all of us. I guess where I kind of want to close out this one is looking just at membership over the last, say 5+ years, both at AREMA, what we're seeing, and maybe what you're seeing. Are you guys seeing a rise or a drop, or is your membership staying is it plateauing? It just seems like professional organizations, whether they're trade or professional organizations like AREMA, recently they're kind of tilting. They're not taking off. And I was just curious if you're seeing that on your side, or I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You'd have to sort of break our membership into two halves to have a conversation about it. On the railroad side, we are blessed, and maybe cursed, but mostly blessed, with a very, very stable membership. Like we have about 500 short lines who are members. There are about 600 in the country. Almost every short line renews, that's a member. Almost everyone renews every year. The people who are members find the association to be kind of invaluable for what they do on many fronts. There's still like maybe these a couple dozen or maybe up to 100 like smaller ones out there that have just never been a member of the association, and it's tough to get them. So there's really not much turnover, growth or decreasing on the railroad side of the membership. On the supplier side of the membership, it's actually grown a little bit over the last few years, and I think that's because short lines continue to grow, and with the grant programs, especially, supplier companies look and see like an opportunity to sell services and sell products to short lines, and joining the association is a pretty cost-effective way to kind of market and get to know those people. But so it's a different business model than the professional associations, which I think are much more aimed at education. But I will say, to express sort of sympathy perhaps with AREMA and the challenge in getting individuals to join, it does feel like the world gets busier and busier, and people get more and more stretched. And so it's not like there's less people out there who would benefit from coming to conferences and joining webinars and being educated, but people just seem like they have less and less time, right? So you gotta, and we're able to do this for the railroads for sure, but you gotta be able to provide something that is not just a nice to have, right? It's gotta be like essentially essential to mangle the English language a little bit there. It's gotta be something that they just need to be a part of. And so that's,
sure,
that's what we try to do.
But you also do have individual members, right? Just like AREMA, where if I was excited or interested to be a part of the Short Line Association, can I join?
No.
How does that work?
It would have to be, the company has to join.
Correct.
Now, in practice, it's the individual that participates, but there would be no way for Walt to join the ASLRRA. It would have to be ARE.
Perfect.
Right? That would have to be the company that would join, but then the person can join the committees and come to the events and be on the webinars and that kind of stuff.
And that's exactly what I'm so glad that's what I wanted you to define, just so people understand it's different when you apply to AREMA. You can be an individual, you can join a technical committee. This is a trade organization, so that aspect of it is different. And NRC is similar to ASLRRA.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think almost every association that I can think of in the industry other than AREMA is a trade association, right? So ASLRRA, AAR, NRC, REMSA, RSI, RSSI, RTA. It really, AREMA has a pretty unique place as a kind of the professional association where individuals can join. And it's really not about, you don't need me to speak about what AREMA is, but it's not about lobbying and regulatory stuff. It's really about education and learning and kind of individual networking. So I think, at ASLRRA, we certainly don't view AREMA as a competitor. There's tons of employees of short lines who are members of AREMA as individuals, and frankly, there should probably be more. I think AREMA is a great association, and I've been to 18 of the last 20 AREMA annual conferences. Certainly all the ones that are part of Railway Interchange and all the standalone ones. I think I missed one time you guys scheduled one in late August and I had kids on vacation and that was tough, but pretty much I'm there every year. And I think it's a great event.
Excellent. Well, we hope to see you in Indianapolis this fall. And it sounds like you guys, just for all the listeners' knowledge, you host a conference yourselves once a year. And my understanding is recently this one was in New Orleans. I unfortunately, as I started at the beginning of this podcast, was unable to make that. But how many vendors did you have there? Was it a success?
It was a big success. I personally, I think our annual conferences are always a success, but I will tell you that holding it in New Orleans was pretty nice this year. People really flocked to it. We came in over 1,800 people, which is actually the second biggest annual conference we've ever had, only behind our 100th anniversary party a decade ago in Atlanta. So that was really gratifying. Of those 1,800, a majority are actually vendors. There's probably 500-600 short line railroaders there, which is pretty good. And it's a really very, very high level group of short line railroaders. It's a lot of owners, presidents, vice presidents, chief commercial officers, those types of folks. But then there's quite a few, vendors, right? Like suppliers, contractors, associate members, who are there to network and talk to all those people and try to sell them stuff and try to learn. And we have a bunch of general session presentations. We had Joe Hinrichs, who's the CSX CEO, was one of our keynoters this year, plus a TSA, Transportation Security Administration deputy director there talking about cybersecurity issues. And then we have dozens of breakout sessions on everything from locomotive inspection issues to how to apply for CRISI grants to insurance troubles to RIF loans and tax credits and state legislation and track engineering issues. So a little bit of overlap with the kind of stuff that they get into at AREMA. But yeah, we do a big annual conference every year. We have a couple much smaller regional conferences in the fall. And those are our babies, and we love those. They're fun for people. They're a great time for people to get together, network. They're also a big part of how we pay for the whole operation over here. Like pretty normal in trade association world, but your annual conference really funds a lot of the rest of the year's activities. So it's very important to us. And our next one is like about 11 months from now, and we'll be in late March 2024 in Kansas City.
Kansas City.
Yeah, not as famously fun as New Orleans, but nevertheless a great rail town and good food and good fun.
Yeah, easy to get to. They got a new airport out there. I got to visit that about a month or so ago. That was pretty cool. So yeah. They've caught up to the rest of the country in airports, which is good, which will make for a great conference, I think. And I think there's probably no better way to end this one. I just looked at the clock, and hey, you know what? We had a heck of a gap there from the last episode. So why not give the listeners what they want, Chuck? More content.
More content. I love it.
That's right. Well, thank you, Chuck, for being on the show. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you continuing to be a friend of AREMA. I look forward to seeing you in Indianapolis this fall, and then I will see you in Kansas City next spring.
Well, I was thrilled to do this. I really appreciated being invited. I love AREMA. I will definitely see you at the next AREMA event, and hopefully, like you said, also see people at future Shortline Association events.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you for rolling with AREMA on today's episode of Platform Chats. For further information about AREMA, please visit arema.org or contact us at info@arema.org.